A passenger landed a failing Boeing 737 with 156 people on board. No uniform. No cockpit training that anyone knew about. Just a woman in economy class with a journal in her hands. When the captain woke up in hospital and asked who landed his failing aircraft, the answer left everyone speechless. Just a passenger, they said. It was a Thursday, 4:17 p.m. December 3, 2020. Captain Oliver Bradford was lying flat on his back in a hospital bed at Kansas City International Medical Center, staring at the white ceiling above him with one eye that worked and one eye that didn't want to open all the way. There was an 4 tube in his right arm. His left hand wouldn't move no matter how hard he tried. His head felt like someone had stuffed it full of wet cotton. He had been flying for 30 years, and he had never in all those years felt this helpless, this confused, this completely lost. He blinked. He tried to organize his thoughts. The last thing he could remember was sitting in the cockpit at 34,000 feet over the flat brown fields of Kansas, and then something had gone wrong inside his head, not with the aircraft, not with the instruments, not with the weather, but inside his own skull, a sudden terrible pressure that had swept over the left side of his body like a wave pulling him under. And then nothing. Just black. A nurse came into the room. Her name tag said Helen. She was a kind-looking woman in her 50s with gray hair and soft eyes, and she smiled when she saw that Captain Bradford was awake. She adjusted something on the 4 machine and then patted his right hand gently. Captain Bradford opened his mouth and the words came out slow and slurred, like he had to drag each one up from somewhere deep inside him. "Who landed my aircraft?" he asked. "Who brought Flight 5829 down?" Helen kept smiling. She used the kind of calm, simple voice that people use with patients who have just come back from somewhere frightening. "Don't you worry about that now, Captain," she said. "Just rest. A passenger helped. Everyone is safe." But Captain Bradford was a man who needed to understand what happened to his aircraft. That was not the kind of question he could let go. He grabbed her wrist with his right hand, the one that still worked, and he looked at her with the full weight of a man who had 21,000 flight hours and a deep and serious responsibility for every single person who had ever sat behind him in a plane. "Who?" he said again. "Who landed it?" Helen sighed and walked to the door and said something quietly into the hallway. A few moments later, a woman in a gray jacket came into the room. She had a tablet computer under her arm and a lanyard around her neck with an FAA badge on it. Her name was Agent Victoria Brennan, and she had been sitting in that hallway for 3 hours waiting for Captain Bradford to wake up, because she had a story to tell him that she had spent those same 3 hours verifying 17 different ways before she was willing to believe it herself. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. She looked at Bradford steadily. "Captain," she said, "your aircraft was landed by a 31-year-old woman named Dr. Nina Okafor. She was seated in seat 19F. She was traveling alone from Denver to Baltimore. When you had your stroke, she was sitting in economy class reading a medical journal." Captain Bradford blinked. His brow came together slowly. "A doctor," he said. "A medical doctor landed my plane." Agent Brennan shook her head. "Not a medical doctor, Captain. Dr. Okafor has a PhD in aerospace engineering from the California Institute of Technology. She also has 2,100 flight hours in military aircraft. She worked as a test pilot for classified experimental programs run by the United States Air Force and by DARPA. She left that career 18 months ago. On the day your aircraft got into trouble, she was a professor at Johns Hopkins University, quietly reading a journal article in seat 19F. When your first officer started to panic, she stood up, walked to the cockpit, and landed your Boeing 737 so smoothly that most of the passengers sitting behind her had no idea the captain was unconscious until after the wheels were already on the ground. Captain Bradford was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the Kansas City sky was going orange and purple in the evening light. He let the information settle into his mind piece by piece. A passenger. A woman in a Howard University sweatshirt. A professor. And yet also a test pilot with 2,100 hours. Also a PhD who had written her entire doctoral dissertation on emergency recovery procedures for failing aircraft. He thought about the men and women on that plane, the business travelers, the students heading home for winter break, the families, the children. 156 people. And somewhere in the middle of all of them, sitting quietly by the window in row 19, had been the one person in the world with exactly the right knowledge, exactly the right experience, and exactly the right calm to bring them all home safe. He did not know whether to feel amazed or humbled or something else entirely. He felt all of it at once. To understand what happened on Southwest Airlines Flight 5829 that Thursday afternoon, you have to understand who Nina Okafor really was, not just who she appeared to be when she walked through an airport in jeans and a sweatshirt with a backpack over one shoulder. Nina had grown up in a house where aircraft were not mysterious things. Her father was a Nigerian immigrant who had come to the United States in his 20s and built a life for himself as a commercial airline mechanic. From the time Nina was 6 years old, he had sometimes taken her to work with him on weekends. She would sit in the cockpits of the wide-body jets while her father worked on them, not flying, just sitting, studying the dials and switches and levers with the focused intensity of a child who had found her thing. By the time she was 12 years old, she could identify almost any aircraft flying over their neighborhood in Maryland by the sound of its engines alone. She could tell a 737 from a 757, a regional jet from a turboprop, just by listening with her head tilted slightly to the side. Her father thought this was remarkable. Her teachers thought she was unusually focused. Nina just thought it was normal. By the time she was 16, she had already soloed in a small Cessna 172 at a local flight school, sitting in the left seat with her feet on the rudder pedals and her hands on the yoke, flying alone for the first time with the kind of calm that most student pilots do not find until they have many more hours behind them. She went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. on a full scholarship for aerospace engineering. She graduated at 19, at the top of her class. She had been in Air Force ROTC during her time at Howard and she was commissioned as a second lieutenant. She went to pilot training at 21. She graduated first in her class there too. But Nina was not sent to fly fighters or bombers the way many pilots who finish at the top of their class might hope. She was noticed early on for something different, her ability to stay calm when systems were behaving unpredictably, her instinct for what an aircraft was about to do before it did it, her almost mathematical understanding of how things fail. She was selected for the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base in California. It was the most demanding, most elite program in all of military aviation, and Nina entered it at 22 and never looked back. The aircraft that Nina flew as a test pilot were not the famous ones. They did not have popular names or film franchises about them. They were the strange ones, the experimental ones, the ones with program numbers instead of names, the ones that appeared on no public list anywhere. She flew unmanned aerial vehicles that were being tested with human pilots as backup controllers. She flew aircraft fitted with experimental flight control systems that were being evaluated for their ability to keep a plane in the air even when the human pilot became incapacitated. She flew prototypes fitted with adaptive artificial intelligence that could detect a pilot medical emergency and begin managing the aircraft automatically. She was not just flying these systems. She was helping to develop them, to break them, to find their limits, to write the reports that would eventually make commercial aviation safer for hundreds of millions of passengers around the world. At the same time, she was earning her PhD. She studied at night. She wrote her dissertation in the hours between test flights, sitting at a desk in a small apartment on the edge of Edwards with coffee going cold beside her keyboard. She defended her dissertation by video conference from the base. Her topic was emergency recovery procedures for degraded flight control systems, and the research she produced in that work was later cited in 73 published papers and used directly by both Boeing and Airbus in the design of systems that fly in commercial aircraft today. She had logged 2,100 hours in aircraft that most pilots would never see, never touch, never even know existed. She was on a path to become one of the youngest test pilot program commanders in the history of the United States Air Force. Then came August 2019. The details of what happened that month are classified, and the full report exists only in a filing system that requires special clearance to access. What is known is that Nina was flying an experimental aircraft fitted with an autonomous recovery system that had not yet been certified. Something went wrong with the aircraft during the test flight. The autonomous system became confused and began sending contradictory signals to the flight controls. The aircraft started to behave in ways that no aircraft should behave. Nina took manual control. She fought the aircraft. She used everything she knew, every hour she had ever logged, every procedure she had ever studied, every instinct that 8 years of test flying had built inside her, and she landed it. She walked away with minor injuries. The aircraft was reparable. By every external measure, the test flight was a success. The data collected that day eventually helped engineers correct the flaw in the autonomous system. Lives would one day be saved because of what Nina had done in those minutes over the California desert. But something had changed in Nina after she walked away from that aircraft. It was not a dramatic thing. She did not cry or shake or have any kind of obvious breakdown. She simply sat down in the debrief room afterward, answered all the questions she was asked with her usual precision and calm, and then walked outside and stood in the desert air and understood with complete clarity that she was done. Not done for today. Done for good. She had spent 8 years flying aircraft that were designed to fail so that engineers could learn from the failures. She had sat in cockpits while systems collapsed around her and held everything together through skill and training and the particular brand of stubbornness that test pilots develop or they do not survive. And she was 30 years old, and she was tired. Tired of almost dying. Tired of classified debriefs. Tired of attending funerals for colleagues who had run out of luck. She had given everything she had to the program and the program had taken it all, every last bit, and she wanted something different now. She wanted to be in a classroom. She wanted to give what she knew to students who were just beginning, who still had the energy and the freshness that she felt she had spent. She resigned her commission. She accepted a position as an associate professor of aerospace engineering at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. She moved into a quiet apartment. She began teaching undergraduates about aerodynamics and flight mechanics. She published papers instead of flying missions. She attended faculty meetings instead of pre-flight briefings. She went running in the mornings along the waterfront. She read. She cooked. She lived a small, careful, safe life, and for 18 months she was deeply, genuinely glad of it. On December 3, 2020, Dr. Nina Okafor boarded Southwest Airlines Flight 5829 at Denver International Airport. She had been in Denver for an academic conference and she was going home to Baltimore. She was traveling light, a small black backpack under the seat in front of her, a laptop, a water bottle, charging cables, and a novel that she intended to start reading somewhere over Missouri. She had checked in early, boarded during Zone 3, found her window seat in row 19 on the right side of the aircraft, and settled in with the comfortable routine of someone who flew regularly but with no particular enthusiasm for it. She was wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a Navy Howard University sweatshirt, her undergraduate university, the one that had given her her first scholarship and her first real sense of what she could become. She had short natural hair, small gold stud earrings, and a practical watch on her left wrist. She looked like exactly what her boarding pass said she was, a professor, traveling alone, headed home. She pulled her journal from her backpack. It was the IEEE Transactions on Aerospace and Electronic Systems, a technical publication so dense and specialized that most people on the plane would not have been able to read a single page of it without a graduate-level background in the subject. Nina found her place and began reading, making small notes in the margins with a pen. The article she was focused on was about adaptive flight control algorithms, theoretical work, mathematical, the kind of reading that required full concentration and rewarded it with genuine insight. She had been reading for about an hour and a half when the flight was somewhere over Kansas, cruising at 34,000 feet in smooth air, when she noticed something. It was not something that most passengers would have caught. The aircraft was flying normally. The seatbelt sign was off. The flight attendants were working the cabin. There was a baby crying somewhere in the rows behind her and a man across the aisle watching something on his laptop with headphones in. Nothing was visibly wrong. But Nina had 2,100 hours in her body, and some of those hours had been spent in aircraft that were beginning to fail, and she had learned that aircraft announce their distress in very quiet ways long before anything becomes obvious. She heard a subtle change in the engine pitch. Just a fraction of a note, the kind of thing that passes through consciousness without registering unless you have trained yourself to listen for it. And then she felt it, a change in the handling. The very small, constant microcorrections that autopilot makes to keep an aircraft perfectly stable had shifted in their character. Something had happened in the cockpit. She set her journal down in her lap. She listened. She watched the aircraft around her the way a doctor watches a patient's face when they are looking for something that has not yet become a symptom. The PA crackled on. The voice that came through was young and male and had a quality in it that Nina recognized immediately, the quality of someone who was trying very hard to sound composed and was not entirely succeeding. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Reeves. We are experiencing Captain Bradford has become ill. We are working on it. Please remain seated." That was all. The PA clicked off. The cabin stirred with the particular unease that passengers feel when something has been said that is clearly leaving out the important part. Nina did not stir with unease. She sat very still and processed the information with the systematic efficiency of someone trained to assess emergency situations. Captain ill. First officer flying alone. The first officer had called himself by name, which meant he was young enough that the habit of authority had not yet made his voice flat and steady. And now the aircraft had disconnected from autopilot, she could feel it. The aircraft was being flown by hand. And the handling told her that the person flying it was fighting it, overcorrecting, not yet in sync with the machine. Then the senior flight attendant came down the aisle. His name was James Wu, and he had been flying with Southwest for 20 years, and his face had the look of a man maintaining his professional composure through a real effort of will. He stopped at a seat in row 14 and leaned down and spoke quietly to the man sitting there. Nina heard it clearly. "Sir, you indicated on your passenger form you're a private pilot. I need you to come to the cockpit." The man, middle-aged, nervous-looking, a recreational flyer with maybe 200 hours in small single-engine propeller planes, stood up and followed James forward. Nina unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up. James was heading back up the aisle and she intercepted him at row 12. She spoke quietly. "I'm a pilot," she said. "What's the situation?" James looked at her, young woman, college sweatshirt, small backpack, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "Ma'am, thank you, but we've already found someone," Nina kept her voice low and steady. "I have 2,100 flight hours. I'm a former Air Force test pilot. Tell me the captain's status." James stopped. He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then something shifted in his expression. "Stroke," he said. "He's unconscious. The first officer is very young. He only graduated training 6 months ago, and he's panicking. The other passenger, he's only ever flown Cessnas. He doesn't know this aircraft." Nina had already made her decision before he finished the sentence. "Take me to the cockpit," she said. "Right now." The cockpit was a small space and it was full of fear. Captain Bradford was slumped in the left seat with the left side of his face drooping, unconscious, already being monitored by a flight attendant who had basic first aid training. First Officer Thomas Reeves, 26 years old, 1,200 hours, 6 months out of the training program, in what was supposed to be a completely routine flight on a completely routine Thursday afternoon, was in the right seat with both hands gripping the yoke so hard his knuckles had gone white. Sweat was running down the side of his face. The recreational pilot from row 14 was standing behind the seats with the expression of a man who had already determined that whatever was happening here was completely beyond him. "I don't know this aircraft," the man was saying. "I've only flown single-engine props. I don't know how to help." Reeves's voice was cracking. "I can't do this alone. I've never, the captain handles everything. I fly when he tells me to fly. I don't know what to do with all of this by myself." Nina stepped through the door. She looked at Reeves. She looked at the instruments. In the 2 seconds it took her to do this, she absorbed more information than most people take in from a full briefing. "First Officer Reeves," she said, "my name is Dr. Nina Okafor. I'm a former Air Force test pilot. I have 2,100 hours including extensive experience with emergency procedures. I am here to help you." Reeves turned in his seat. He looked at her, young, female, jeans, sweatshirt, and for a moment his face showed the same doubt that James Wu had shown in the aisle. "You're a passenger," he said. Nina did not argue with him. She simply moved to the jump seat and sat down and kept her voice level and authoritative. "I am also the most qualified pilot on this aircraft right now. What are your current numbers?" The familiarity of the question, the way it was asked with the calm expectation of a real pilot, seemed to reach Reeves through his panic. 1,200 hours, he said. 6 months since graduation. "Good," Nina said. "That's enough to fly this aircraft. Tell me what feels wrong." Reeves told her. The aircraft felt heavy and unresponsive. It was fighting him every time he tried to make a correction. He had disconnected autopilot because he could not figure out how to adjust the altitude settings without the captain there to help him, and now the whole machine felt like it was working against him instead of with him. Nina looked at the trim settings and found the problem immediately. When Captain Bradford had lost consciousness, his body had fallen forward slightly and his weight had moved the trim wheel into a configuration that was now working against every input Reeves was making. He was fighting the aircraft's own tendency to climb, and his corrections were making it worse. It was not a catastrophic situation. But for an inexperienced pilot flying alone while terrified, it was a trap. "Your trim is off," Nina told him, in the same steady tone a flight instructor uses when pointing out something correctable. When the captain collapsed, the trim moved. "That's why it feels heavy. I'm going to walk you through fixing it." She talked him through it, step by step, each instruction clear and simple. Reset the trim. Adjust the power setting. Correct the heading. Establish the altitude. Reeves followed her voice the way a climber follows a rope in the dark, not because he could see where he was going but because the rope was there and it was holding. Within 5 minutes, the aircraft was stable. Its handling had become clean and straightforward. Reeves exhaled for what felt like the first time in 20 minutes. Nina picked up the radio. "Kansas City Center, Southwest 5829, we have pilot incapacitation. The captain has had a stroke. The first officer is flying. We are requesting priority handling and vectors to the nearest suitable airport with full medical facilities." The response came back instantly. Controllers at Kansas City Center had been watching Flight 5829 on their radar with growing concern, and the sudden declaration of emergency and the request for vectors produced the kind of organized urgency that air traffic control is specifically trained for. "Southwest 5829, Kansas City Center, roger your emergency. Nearest suitable airport is Kansas City International, bearing 090, 47 miles. Can you maintain current altitude?" Nina looked at the instruments, looked at Reeves, made her assessment. "Affirmative, Kansas City Center. First officer is hand-flying with assistance from a qualified passenger pilot. We are stable." There was a brief pause on the frequency. Then, "Southwest 5829, understand you have passenger pilot assistance. Can you identify?" Nina did not hesitate. She had left this world behind. She had walked away from it deliberately and with good reasons and she did not miss it and she did not want to go back. But there were 156 people sitting behind her, and First Officer Thomas Reeves was 26 years old and frightened and needed to hear certain things said by someone with the right credentials, and so she said them. Kansas City Center, this is Dr. Nina Okafor, former Air Force test pilot, 2,100 hours, assisting the first officer with emergency procedures. There was another pause. Then, Dr. Okafor, Kansas City Center. We are honored to have your expertise. Whatever you need, you have priority. Nina turned from the radio to Reeves. Okay, she said. Let's talk about what happens next. I am going to handle the radio and the navigation and all the systems work. Your job is to fly. Just fly. That is all I need from you. You know how to fly. I watched you correct that overcorrection on the last bank and you did it right. Your hands know what they're doing. Can you trust your hands? Reeves blinked. He was still frightened, she could see it clearly, but the quality of his fear had changed. It was no longer the shapeless, spiraling fear of someone who does not know what to do. It had become the sharp, focused fear of someone who understands the stakes and is choosing to act anyway. I can fly, he said. That's the part I'm good at. Then do that, Nina said. The rest is mine. She began setting up the approach to Kansas City International with the methodical precision of someone who has done this kind of work in far more difficult circumstances than this. She contacted the airport. She established the sequence and the routing. She briefed Reeves on each phase of the approach before they reached it, so that nothing would come as a surprise, so that every change in configuration and speed and altitude would feel anticipated and controlled rather than sudden and alarming. She talked to him the way the best instructors talk, not doing the work for him, but making sure that he always knew what the next piece of the work was going to be, so that he could prepare for it and execute it and trust himself. Airspeed 180 knots, she said. Altitude 12,000. Good. You're doing well. Reeves kept his hands steady on the yoke. Extending flaps to position 1, Nina said. Feel how the aircraft responds. Good. Now you know what it's going to do at position 2. Ready? Ready, Reeves said. His voice was steadier now. The act of flying, the pure physical task of keeping the aircraft in the right attitude at the right speed on the right heading, was doing something for him. It was giving him something to hold on to. Gear down, Nina said. 3 green lights. Good. The aircraft was descending. Kansas City was below them and ahead of them, the runways lit and clear, emergency vehicles already positioned along the taxiways in long lines of flashing light. Reeves asked her, somewhere in the middle of the approach, how she could be so calm. Nina considered the question honestly. Practice, she said. I have flown aircraft with hydraulic systems failing and engines on fire and flight controls that were barely responding. What we have right now is actually a relatively manageable situation. One pilot is incapacitated, but all the aircraft systems are working correctly. You are capable of flying this. The only variable was whether you had support, and now you do. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are saving us. Nina shook her head. No, she said. You are saving us. You are the one flying. I am just the voice in your ear telling you what you already know. The landing was smooth. It was genuinely, technically smooth, not just smooth by the standards of an emergency, but smooth by the standards of any landing on any normal day. Reeves put the aircraft down on the centerline with clean airspeed control and a touchdown that caused no sudden movement in the cabin. The passengers felt the wheels touch and heard the engines reverse, and some of them began to clap, the way people do when they have been holding their breath and have finally been given permission to breathe again. Reeves brought the aircraft to a stop on the runway as instructed by the controllers, and emergency vehicles immediately surrounded them. When he finally took his hands off the yoke and turned to look at Nina, there were tears running freely down his face. I couldn't have done that without you, he said. Nina looked at him steadily. Yes, you could have, she said. You just did. I only reminded you of what was already there. The next several hours were controlled chaos. Paramedics boarded and removed Captain Bradford on a stretcher. He was alive and stable. The stroke had affected the left side of his body and he would need treatment and rehabilitation, but he was alive. The passengers were evacuated from the aircraft with remarkable order, given what had just happened. FAA investigators arrived and the cockpit became a site of official inquiry. Agent Victoria Brennan found Nina standing near one of the service vehicles, her backpack still on her back, watching the controlled activity around the aircraft with the quiet attention of someone who has been in many situations like this and knows that her part in it is already over. Brennan introduced herself and asked if Nina would speak with her. Nina said yes. They sat in a small room inside the terminal for 2 hours. Brennan had witness statements, cockpit voice recorder data, radar tracks, radio transcripts, and a growing collection of documents related to Nina's military background, most of which required clearances that Brennan had spent the afternoon obtaining. She had verified the story from 17 different angles before she fully believed it, and even now there was a quality of barely contained astonishment in the way she asked her questions. Dr. Okafor, she said at one point, why didn't you identify yourself as a pilot when you boarded the aircraft? Nina thought about this carefully before answering. Because I'm not a pilot anymore, she said. I am a professor. I left flying 18 months ago. When I got on that plane, I was a passenger. That is all. Brennan looked at her notes. But your experience, the hours, the test flying, the background in emergency recovery systems, why walk away from that? Nina was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent lights in the small terminal room hummed. Outside, through the window, the emergency vehicles were still working around the aircraft on the taxiway. Because I was tired of almost dying, she said finally. Test flying means pushing aircraft to the edge of what they can do. You push until something breaks. And sometimes what breaks is the aircraft, and sometimes what breaks is the system, and sometimes what breaks is the person in the seat. I gave 8 years to that work and I am proud of what came out of it. But I wanted to live a life that was not organized around the question of whether today was the day I ran out of luck. But today you went back to it, Brennan said. Nina looked at her. Today, people needed me. That is different from choosing to risk my life for data. Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dr. Okafor, what you did today may have saved 156 lives. First Officer Reeves is a capable young pilot. But he is inexperienced, and he was in a situation he had never been trained for, in the truest sense, a situation where the authority figure he had always depended on was gone and the full weight of every decision was suddenly on him alone. The statistics on pilot incapacitation incidents involving inexperienced first officers are not encouraging. Without intervention, the probability of a serious outcome in a situation like this is significant. Nina nodded slowly. She had read those statistics. She had contributed to some of the research that produced them. He flew the aircraft, she said. I want to make sure that is in the record. Thomas Reeves flew that aircraft from the point of emergency to the point of landing. I provided guidance and handled systems work. But the control was his. Brennan wrote something down. The FAA is going to study this incident, she said. Because it raises questions about how we train first officers for incapacitation scenarios. About whether 6 months of line flying is enough before a pilot is truly ready to be alone in a cockpit. About what we expect people to do when the expected structure of authority disappears. Good, Nina said. Learn from it. That's what incidents are for. Brennan looked at her. Will you consult? Help us understand what the training gaps are. Nina smiled, but it was a specific kind of smile, the smile of someone who has already answered this question inside herself. I'm a professor, she said. I teach and I research. That is how I help now. 3 weeks later, Nina was back at Johns Hopkins. The story had spread, of course, something like this does not stay quiet. The headline that ran in most places was some version of "Professor lands plane after captain's stroke, was just reading a journal." Nina declined every interview request. She declined the television appearances and the podcast invitations and the speaking engagements and the congratulatory letters from aerospace organizations that wanted to give her awards. She went back to her classroom and her papers and her quiet apartment and her morning runs along the waterfront. She was not interested in becoming a story. She had been someone else's story before, the Air Force's story, the test program story, and she had walked away from that, and she did not want to be a story now. She wanted to be a teacher. There was one letter she did not decline. It arrived in her faculty mailbox at Johns Hopkins about 2 weeks after the incident, handwritten on plain paper in the careful, slightly self-conscious handwriting of someone who does not write many letters. It said, "Dr. Okafor, I have been trying to find words adequate to what I want to say and I don't think I've found them, but here is the attempt. You saved 156 lives. But more than that, and I know this will sound strange, you showed me what it actually means to be a pilot under real pressure. Not pressure in training, not pressure in simulation, but actual pressure with actual consequences. I have been flying since I was 19 years old and I thought I knew what I was doing. I did not know what I was doing. I knew a set of procedures. There is a difference, and I did not understand the difference until you sat down in that jump seat and reminded me that flying is not about procedures. It's about knowing the aircraft and trusting yourself. I am going back to advanced training. I am going to learn everything I should have learned the first time. Because you showed me that competence matters more than confidence, and that the difference between the two is what keeps people alive. Thank you for being exactly where we needed you. Thomas Reeves. Nina read that letter 3 times. Then she put it in the top drawer of her desk, where she could look at it when she needed to remember why teaching mattered. It stayed there. 6 months after the incident, Captain Oliver Bradford had recovered well enough to be living at home in Kansas City, going to physical therapy 3 times a week, regaining much of the function in his left arm and leg with slow, steady, determined work. He was 53 years old and he had been flying for 30 years and he did not intend to spend the rest of his life sitting in a chair thinking about what he had missed. His doctors told him he would probably be able to return to some form of flying. He was not sure he wanted to. But he wanted to meet the woman who had landed his aircraft. He wrote to her through the FAA, and she agreed to meet him for coffee in Baltimore on a Tuesday morning in June. They sat at a small table by the window in a coffee shop near the Johns Hopkins campus. Bradford had a cane, which he set against the table with the self-consciousness of a man still getting used to needing it. Nina had a mug of tea and a stack of papers she had been marking before he arrived, which she moved to one side. They looked at each other for a moment in the way that two people look at each other when they share something significant that they have never spoken about directly. "Dr. Okafor," Bradford said, "I need to know who landed my aircraft." Nina raised an eyebrow slightly. "You know who," she said. "The investigation report told you." "I know the facts," Bradford said. "I want to know the person." Nina was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the Baltimore morning was gray and mild, the kind of weather that asks nothing of anyone. "I'm a professor," she said. "I teach aerospace engineering at the university down the street. I used to fly experimental aircraft for the Air Force. I left. I came back for one flight. That is all." Bradford shook his head slowly. "That is not all," he said. "You saved my life. You saved my crew. You saved every person who was sitting on that aircraft." "Thomas Reeves saved them," Nina said. "He flew the aircraft. I only reminded him he could." Bradford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Nina would think about for a long time afterward. "I have been flying for 30 years, he said. And what I have learned from all of this is something I should have understood before: the most qualified person is not always in the cockpit. Sometimes they are sitting in 19F reading a journal. And maybe the question we should be asking is not who is flying the aircraft, but who, among everyone on that aircraft, is most prepared to keep everyone safe when the unexpected happens? Nina looked at him. That's a philosophical question for the FAA, she said. Bradford smiled. Will you ever fly again? Professionally? Nina shook her head. I teach now, she said. That is my flying. Bradford nodded slowly, as if this made complete sense to him. As a pilot, in a way it might not make sense to other people. Then the people you teach will be better for it, he said. Because whoever learns from you will understand something that is very hard to teach, what it actually means to keep your head when everything around you is asking you to lose it. Dr. Nina Okafor never returned to professional flying. She stayed at Johns Hopkins. She taught her classes and published her research and went running in the mornings and read on the weekends and lived the careful, quiet life she had chosen for herself 18 months before a 737 needed her over Kansas. But the students who came through her program noticed something about her that set her apart from other professors, something they could not always name precisely but felt clearly. It was the way she talked about failure, not as a theoretical possibility to be studied from a safe distance, but as a real thing that real systems do in real conditions, and the only honest response to which is preparation, and calm, and the willingness to act when action is the only thing left. It was the way she talked about emergency procedures, not as a checklist to be memorized but as a living, adaptive way of thinking that has to be built into the pilot the way reflexes are built into the body. It was the way she talked about the gap between knowing something and being able to do something under pressure, and why that gap exists, and how to close it. Her students became some of the most rigorous, most prepared, most genuinely competent aerospace engineers to graduate from any program in the country. They went to Boeing, to Airbus, to NASA, to the FAA, to research programs across the industry, and they carried with them a standard for preparation and for honest thinking about failure that came directly from the woman who had been sitting in seat 19F on a Thursday afternoon in December, reading a journal article about adaptive flight control systems, when the universe decided that all of that preparation was needed immediately and that there was no one else on board qualified to use it. The question that Agent Victoria Brennan raised in her investigation report, the question that Bradford had returned to in the coffee shop in Baltimore, was the one that stayed with the aviation community long after the incident itself faded from the news cycle. How many other flights, on any given day, carry passengers more qualified than the crew for specific types of emergencies? How many people are sitting in economy class with skills that have never been declared, that do not appear on any passenger manifest, that exist only inside the person's training and experience and memory? It is a question without a comfortable answer, because the answer implies something about the gap between the qualifications we check for and the qualifications that matter when things go wrong. The aviation industry is exceptionally safe. Its safety record is the product of decades of accumulated learning and rigorous standardization and honest investigation of everything that goes wrong so that it can be prevented from going wrong again. But Flight 5829 was a reminder that the universe is not always arranged according to the organizational chart, and that sometimes the person who can save everyone is not the one sitting in the front with the wings on their jacket. Sometimes that person is a 31-year-old professor in a Howard University sweatshirt, sitting in the window seat of row 19 with a technical journal open in her lap, who answered the question, who landed the failing aircraft, with the simplest possible truth: just a passenger. Just a passenger who happened to have 2,100 flight hours, a doctorate in emergency recovery procedures, and the particular, hard-won, irreplaceable skill of knowing exactly what to do when every system around her was asking her to panic and she chose, instead, to fly.